This week on Act Out, a small town in Sweden is recognized by the EU as being the greenest city in Europe. So what goes into that? What are community members and politicians doing to make their home more sustainable? And how could we emulate some of this work in our own American communities? Answers to that and a lot more. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. I know it's flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. In the south of Sweden, nestled in forests and picturesque lakes, is the small city of Växjö. With a population of roughly 91,000 people, most Americans would probably consider it to be quaint. And while I wouldn't really disagree with that, I mean, take a look at some of these pictures, Växjö is more than just a quaint little city with a Harry Potter-esque castle and a double-pronged church tower. As the self-proclaimed greenest city in Europe, Växjö has a lot to live up to, and it's doing a pretty damn good job. Yeah, it won the 2018 Greenleaf Award, an award given to European cities that display a strong commitment to environmental protection and sustainability. Yes, it's also a member of several international committees and networks such as Energy Cities and the Covenant of Mayors, the latter of which requires signatories to go beyond the EU's stated climate goals. But let's be real, accolades are only worth the work that's happening on the ground, or, as is also the case, in the ground, in the water, in the air. Environmental coordinator Henriks explains his role and gives us some of the backstory.
My role is I'm working in a department called sustainability section, and we are situated directly under the politicians. My role is, and my team's role is to try to move the whole municipality further towards a more green and sustainable city, both internally in the organization but also in the whole community as such. My personal role is devoted much more towards energy and climate. I'm involved in creating strategies with targets to see what we want to do and how we're going to get there. And I'm also responsible for the follow-up to see how it goes. So I'm the one keeping track of all the statistics related to energy and climate as well. Our environmental work started in the 70s. The reason then was that the lakes were suffering from eutrophication because hundreds and hundreds of years everything from the city was emitted and outletted in the lakes, and there was a very bad flow of fresh water through the lakes, so what was in the lakes stayed there. At the same time, Växjö was growing. The whole municipality now has 91,000 inhabitants, and the city 65,000. And we grow about 1,000 inhabitants every year. And we realized that we cannot have green, smelly lakes in the middle of the city, because that was the fact. And I remember when I was a child, I would never even consider go swimming in those lakes. Nowadays I can do that because the politicians decided that we need to do something about the lakes. We need to restore them. The municipality removed sediments from the bottoms of the lakes. We added fresh water from other lakes through pipelines beneath the city. We improve the ecological balance between different species of fish, so we have more predators and less of the others, and also made sure that stormwater from the city didn't enter the lakes without purification. So we have canals and lagoons taking care of particles and oil from the city, and then the cleaner water goes out in the lakes. So that is something that we really started with. And from that, we could see that if we really want to do something, we can get results. And that has been in the mind of the politicians and the people since then, that if we want to do something and we do it together, we will achieve results.
What? That's a thing that happens? And he said pipelines of fresh water constructed to be to clean the lake. As in, pipelines can be used for something other than toxic sludge or an excuse to perpetuate violent capitalist colonialism in the name of white supremacist profit. Whoa. But wait, there's more.
In 1980, we started to use biomass as a heating source. And that was not of environmental causes, it was a security cause. Because in the 70s, we used only oil for heating, and we have our own energy company owned by the municipality, and they provide heating to all the buildings in the city, almost all. And they were using only oil, and after an oil crisis, of course, the costs go up dramatically. And the oil company, the energy company said that we don't want our citizens to suffer because what is going on somewhere else. So we need to find our own local energy sources. And we said we practically live in the middle of the woodshed. We have forests everywhere. So let's use that forest, but we do not cut down forests to burn them. That is very important to state. We take the rest products from the forestry industry. So the things that cannot be used for timber and cannot be used for paper, then that we can use for energy, which meant that we needed to buy that forestry waste from the forest owners. And we have many small forest owners, families owning forest, which meant that they earned some income. And it was good for the local economy as well then, because they got more money. And since they pay taxes to the city, it means that the city got more money to improve the welfare. So it was a win-win situation for Växjö to start focusing on our own local energy source.
So here's a really interesting note, because something you hear a lot about in the vapid volleys of political debates is the issue of energy independence. Oh, we have to stop relying on foreign oil to keep America running. And sure, that makes sense, but the analysis that's then offered up by both sides of the aisle, I might add, is to tap into our own oil and gas reserves. The problem, of course, is that, well, there are lots of problems, but the studies show that it's not economically feasible to tap those. Even when you consider all the subsidies that fossil fuels get from our government, they're still not beating out renewables in terms of cost. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of environmental destruction that's caused via fossil fuel projects that inevitably hit the economy in a myriad of ways, from toxic spill cleanup to the sharpened effects of climate change, thanks to the destruction of natural barriers and filters like forests and wetlands. And as Henrik pointed out, the initial push behind using biomass initially wasn't even to be green. But as the public paradigm shifted in the mid-90s towards being green, the solution was there, implemented, and could then be improved upon. Indeed, in the mid-90s, Växjö announced that they would be fossil-free by 2030, a bold and very much ahead of its time statement. One of the things that's helping them get there is biomass. So, digging a bit deeper into all of this, what is biomass? So, roughly 70% of Sweden is forest or wooded areas. 80% of that land is in active use. 1% of that land is felled annually. Meanwhile, replanting regulations require the planting of 2 trees for every 1 felled. Thanks to this and other regulatory demands, Sweden's forests are actually growing. Which of course in turn means that the industry is doing well, and for Växjö, well, they made and make an obvious partner for sustainable fuel. Biomass is essentially the waste that's created from the forestry industry, and interestingly enough, if not used for energy production, it's left to rot, where it then releases methane, which, as you know from watching this show, is a more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. Meanwhile, the ash that's then from that burnt wood parts is returned to the forest. These ashes contain plant nutrients that both fertilize and mitigate acidification. The goal here is to create a closed ecological system with zero waste. And while burning wood waste, of course, does release some particulate matter, this too can be addressed via technological advancements in boilers. And Växjö Energy installed a new boiler in 2015 to address that. And already back in 2015, Växjö Energy could boast that waste wood was delivering 90% of heat and 1/4 of all electricity. The Sandvik power plant, which you can see here, sticking up out of a collar of trees picturesquely situated by Lake Trummen, complete with a little castle tower in the distance and across from newly constructed green buildings and bike and pedestrian paths. This power plant's biomass program meant that in 2017, more than 240,000 tons of CO2 were not released into the atmosphere. Thanks to this and other endeavors.
So far we have reduced our emissions compared to the levels of 1993 per capita by 58%. And those new figures came this morning. So they are really fresh. You are one of the first to actually know about this. Actually, even before the politicians. So, yeah. I mean, okay, this is not enough to go all the way, but 58% reduction since 1993 is a lot. And we are now about emitting 1.9 tons of CO2 per capita, and that is very low.
As a comparison, the US as a whole releases roughly 16.22 tons per capita. And to be fair, that's taking the entire country into consideration. As a country, Sweden is roughly 5.5 tons per capita. So obviously there are places in the US that fall below that 16.22 marker, and some that hit above. That being said, it's really hard to find information on that, particularly for smaller towns and cities such as Växjö. State CO2 per capita emissions can be found and range from 4.55 on the low end to more than 111 on the high end. When it comes to other environmental indicators such as recycling, the US is even further behind. A recent report outlines just how shitty we are at it. While the overall US recycling rate hovers around an embarrassing 34%, it turns out that a lot of Americans that do recycle aren't doing it properly. A recycling facility in Phoenix, Arizona spends as much as $1 million in lost time due to improper recycling, mostly because of having to remove plastic bags. So the article then suggests that you just instead throw the bag away. Save the machinery, destroy the planet. Meanwhile, in Sweden, some grocery stores have started a plastic bag recycling program based on the incredibly successful Pant program that incentivizes people to recycle plastic bottles and aluminum cans by giving them money for each one that they recycle. Pant facilities are found at places like grocery stores and corner markets, and what you recycle can then be used to reduce the final bill of your groceries. So now this same system is being turned towards plastic bags. The idea is that since Sweden incinerates its waste, the less plastic they burn, the better. Sweden sees these sort of incentives as more powerful than a plastic bag ban. And considering that even before the plastic bag recycling program went into effect, only 1% of Sweden's household waste ended up in landfills, I'd say that they're probably right. And indeed, places like Rhode Island have actually taken a page from this colorful and clear book on recycling and introduced a standardized labeling system on many of the state's recycling bins. As noted by a Rhode Island official, every bin and label looks very different elsewhere, and that's why the public doesn't know how to recycle. And this is really the crux of the issue. American citizens aren't inherently dumber or less concerned than Swedes. They're simply products of their environment.
In schools, we have also a good relation with nature. I remember when I was a child, every second week we went to the forest to see what has happened since last time we were here. So, and we have the nature everywhere. So of course you get this relation that you don't want to destroy this. But of course, education is something that we need to continue all the time, and we talk a lot about environmental issues in schools and also in working places, about how can we become more and more sustainable here in our working place. But what we do, as I said before, is that we try to make incentives so that people can be part of this, even if so they can choose to be part of the good things for the environmental aspects. So for instance, when it comes to recycling, we have this system where you sort out, of course you sort out everything like plastics and paper and glass and so on, but you have to take that to a recycling station. And it's not sure that you have that at your house. But at your house, you have the possibility to sort incinerable waste and organic waste in 2 different bins, but it's not compulsory. But if you do not sort, then you have to pay more, pay a higher fee to the municipality. So it's a financial incentive to actually sort, but we do never force anyone. So 85% of the households, or even if it's 88% of the households, actually sort out the organic waste. And what do we do with this? Well, we produce our own fuel for the buses, biogas. So it's a good way of taking care of the energy that is in this organic waste. And all our buses are using biogas produced from local organic waste that otherwise just would be incinerated. And very soon we will also have another system where we will make it possible for citizens to recycle everything back home. So there will be like 8 fractions to sort at homes. So you don't need to travel to a recycling station. And then we think that also the recycling levels will rise even further.
Växjö Green Party group leader Cheryl Jones-Fyr echoed these sentiments when I spoke to her as well.
Sustainability is a part of the school plan for all young people, that they have to learn about sustainability as a part of their school. So I think that when we started recycling, it was the school kids you start with, and then they go home to their parents and say, oh no, you can't throw that glass bottle away, you have to put it in the recycle bin. So, it's the best way to get a change in society started, is to start with the kids.
Teach the kids and incentivize the adults. Not just in things like recycling, but in all aspects like transportation and food.
We are all the time building more cycling paths and making them faster, cleaner, safer. We build like highways for cyclists, which means that they should know that if I go on this path, I will not have to cross a car road more than maybe once or twice. And I will definitely, it's very clearly marked so that it will not be mixed with pedestrians. We clear the cycle paths out of snow before the car roads in wintertime. And we make sure that people can feel safe around the cycle paths as well. When we invested in more buses a few years ago, or when we invested in the biogas buses, we also invested in 40% more buses, which meant that suddenly there was a much more a better frequency between the bus stops. So you didn't need to be sure that you were there exactly that half hour, because then if you really miss that bus, there's another one coming within 10 minutes, and of course that increased the levels of the shares of people using bus. So that is the kind of incentives we're doing. We are also having campaigns where we let people borrow, for instance, an electric bike during 2 weeks and try it and see if you like it. And many of those people have actually bought themselves their own electric bike later on. And why should you have an electric bike? Well, it could be good for those people who normally would use the car. They would see that, okay, I can still come quite fast to the work and I'm not sweaty.
Or the elderly,
elderly people, it's also good for them because they can still be out cycling and it will not be difficult. So that is also how we can work with campaigns, asking people, involving people in those, trying things. When it comes to food, we see that there is a trend in Sweden that more and more people are more conscious about the food. They want to have organic food and they want to have locally produced food. And so we see that there is a big movement among the citizens that they want to find these things, and they put demands on the city. Make sure that you buy Swedish food, make sure that you buy local food, make Swedish meat, for instance. It has been a big discussion in Sweden about how can we make sure that what kind of can we have requirements forcing us to buy Swedish food, Swedish meat instead of German meat, for instance, right, or Italian meat or whatever, or Danish meat, because Sweden has some of the highest animal protection rights, so to say, in the world.
Växjö has also volleyed plans for things like Meatless Mondays, to once again teach kids about reducing carbon footprints by eating more sustainably. New construction, of which there is plenty, is not only plugging in to the district heating network so as to avoid using non-renewables for heating and thereby using that biomass, but many new buildings will also have energy displays so that residents can keep track of their energy use and make changes based on those readings. These sort of implementations require a two-way street. The people are engaged and educated. They demand progress, and politicians respond by not only working to actualize those demands, but in return, incentivizing the people both socially and economically to be that change. Because as we see in the US, and as I mentioned, even though recycling exists, it's not something that we largely incorporate into our daily lives. And of course, a lot of that is our fault. Looking at you, well-off white people who have the money, education, and time, but don't give a flying fuck. But some of that is also the system. The lack of education around what can be recycled here or there. For instance, on this plastic bag of raisins in Sweden, on the back in clear lettering, it says to recycle this waste as plastic. Furthermore, it's the lack of education in the US, highlighting the importance of recycling, of biking, using public transportation. It's a lack of infrastructure, access to recycling facilities, particularly for folks in apartment buildings, where very often management companies don't bother to set up recycling bins at all. Lack of reliable public transport, lack of bike paths, food deserts, and the proliferation of some of the worst food to our school kids. I mean, look at that shit. It looks like it slopped off a makeup artist's desk on set of Walking Dead. It's also the fact that up until recently, we were shipping 30% of our recycling to China for processing, and now it's only 3% thanks to the new regulations in China. So what's going to happen with that 27%? Look out, landfills. In short, we the people aren't doing enough, and our politicians sure as shit aren't doing enough. And a lot of that, again, is systemic. Career politicians and the lack of accountability to the people.
We have something that's called medborgarförslag, citizens' suggestions that come up in the city council and get treated. And sometimes we pass them, and sometimes we say, no, that's too expensive, or we're doing something else instead that's better. And I think I'm really glad that there's activists, that there's lobby organizations, the nature conservation organization here in Sweden is really strong, and they're needed. But I think politicians are needed as well, because we have to then see that the things get done. We can make the decisions that we do build more bike paths, whereas maybe the biking lobby can say, well, that's not enough. And they're probably right, but we do what we can.
Right. And so would you say that it's more of a case of, maybe because of the multiple parties or how the system is set up, but would you say that it's ordinary citizens that then become politicians, as opposed to how it is in the US, where it's career politicians who just stay there like a tick for like decades?
That's one of the reasons why I became a politician here in Sweden. I just all of a sudden realized just exactly what you said, that it was ordinary people that were politicians. School teachers, nurses. Like I said, I'm a zoologist. We have in the Green Party, we have many small business owners that are active.
And if you're someone who cringes at the line, "we need politicians," I get it, me too. But let's just say that you replace that word with experts or project leaders or what have you. The point is, regardless of what system you implement, you're going to need people to actualize those decisions and demands reached by the community. And in those cases, you want that person to be your neighbor. You don't want it to be some dick rag who lives thousands of miles away in a mansion and doesn't give two shits about whether or not there's a crude oil pipeline in your backyard. You want someone who is accessible and who you know cares, because it's their ass on the line, not just politically, but socially. And as I've said many times on this show, this is also why local politics are so damn important. Remember, Växjö is a town of less than 100,000 people. And that's not to take anything away from their badassery, but it's worth noting that markers such as these are much easier to reach on a local level. A 40% increase in public transportation use in 13 years. A 58% decrease in CO2 emissions. Proximity to green spaces and bus stops, more than half of all energy use pulled from renewable sources. These kind of goals are attainable anywhere, but they have to start on a local level. It has to start with real community engagement and education. And we know in the US, since the impetus for progress is not going to come from the politicians first, we have to be the ones to demand it. Indeed, even in idyllic Sweden, there is still and will always be a need for environmental activism. Since the start of school a couple of weeks ago, a 15-year-old girl has been sitting outside of Parliament in Stockholm on a school strike, demanding immediate and powerful action on climate. And to her I say, fuck yes. Because the truth is, we're not doing enough. We need to stop all use of fossil fuels on a global scale yesterday. We need to eat less meat. We need to end all wars which contribute grossly to climate change, not to mention global instability. And we should not be afraid to demand these things. We should not be afraid to stand resolutely in the face of so much corruption, so much pollution, and demand what we know is possible. People and planet over profit. Växjö is still nestled in capitalism. Fortunately for them, their economy has actually grown thanks to their environmental progress, something shared by Sweden as a whole. In 2014, for instance, Sweden imported 2.3 million tons of trash, charging $43 per ton, thereby raking in almost $100 million to literally take care of other people's shit. Something that the faltering economy in the US might want to consider as we stare down the growing mounds of trash that we can no longer chuck over to China. But still, the question remains, can we ever be truly sustainable in a capitalist world? In a system built on the tenets of extraction, oppression, and profit? Ultimately, no. And yet, does this mean that we should discount efforts such as those happening in Växjö and across the country of Sweden? Or even in the US? Does it mean that our resolute understanding of capitalism and our unwavering fight for its abolition must give way to an absolutist paradigm critical of any progress under a capitalist system? I hope not. We need to be able to recognize and support and indeed emulate progress that undercuts the destruction of our environment through partnerships, enforcement of sustainable policy, legislative incentives, and more.
In 1996 or in 1995, we started a cooperation with the biggest environmental organization in Sweden, the Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, Naturskyddsföreningen, because we wanted to make sure that we did good environmental things. We wanted to do good things from the beginning instead of doing things and then have someone else say you should have been doing like that.
And having to clean it up after.
Yeah. So we thought that we can learn a lot from each other. We learn a lot from the organization, and the organization learn a lot about how does municipalities work. So we had a 3-year project, a cooperation project. We started lots of mini projects all around Växjö in various fields. They helped us organize meetings with the community in order to have discussions. What do people in this village want, and what do people within this industry want? So kind of thematic and geographically different meetings. And during this cooperation, this organization said it would be interesting to see if Växjö could be edgy in some aspect, and suggested that to say something about climate change. And after educating the politicians and the staff and listening to what the people from the United Nations Climate Panel says and what the researchers says and what the companies locally said about this, our mayor at the time said, we cannot go on. We have to stop using fossil fuels. This is not sustainable. And shortly after that, there was a unanimous political decision that we are going to be a fossil fuel-free city.
And this was in the mid-90s.
This was in 1996. So that was before the Kyoto conference.
Yeah.
We didn't know by then how to reach it. We didn't know what to do. We didn't know where we stood. And we didn't decide when we wanted to achieve this. So therefore, we needed to start inventing, in making those inventories of see how much energy do we use and what kind of emissions do we have, and that is what I'm doing right now every year. And we needed to have some kind of strategy for how to reduce this. And later on, we decided that this target should be achieved by 2030, which means roughly 12 years more. It will be difficult. We will probably not really go all the way by 2030, maybe 2035. Because we have an airport, there's always someone who has an old car somewhere, because this is something that is target for the whole geographical area. So everyone is included in this target, and it is our responsibility to make sure that it will be as easy as possible for everyone to be part of this. We can never force people to change the cars or something, but we can make it easy to have the alternatives.
Incentives.
Yeah, improve the cycling paths and make it easier to go by bus and so on. Make sure that there is possibilities to charge your electric cars and so on. One is the requirement that we have that when we build new areas for housing, we say that we want this to be connected to the district heating system, because it means that when we produce much more heat from renewable fuels, we also produce more power. And if we produce more power from renewable fuels, it also means that we can get rid of fossil power production in Denmark and Poland and Germany. So it's good for the whole Europe that we produce more local green power here.
We have a job to do to spread our successes as well as telling about when things don't work out like we had thought, our failures with other cities. We work within, in Sweden, there's a group called Climate Cities that we're a member of that organization, where we share experiences in the climate issues. And on the European level, we're in a group called Energy Cities that also gathers cities that work in these. And we've also signed the Covenant of Mayors, which is cities worldwide that are working on these issues. So it's very important that we share both successes and failures so that other cities can see. Of course, we, like I said, on district heating, we get our heating, we fuel that with the forest waste. Cities that don't have any forest, of course, have to find other solutions. But maybe a city that has lots of forest around can think, yeah, but look at Växjö. They've done this. Maybe we could do it as well.
Furthermore, we have to also recognize the connectivity of our issues, because the environmental problems we face do not exist in a vacuum, and sustainability means more than just wind farms and recycling.
What we're doing right now is that we are taking a look at the global goals for sustainability, the 17 global goals that the United Nations adopted, and we are bringing them down to us to see what do they mean for us, what do we need to think of. And that is, of course, everything. It's not only environment, it's also sustainable growth, it's sustainable education, making sure that everyone have access to human rights, and bringing all this together. And we are right now making an inventory of seeing where are we in various aspects, and that will of course also help us seeing where do we have the big challenges, which we will need to address in the future. Since 3 years we are a sustainability section, so we include people working with those aspects. We have one person working with human rights, equal opportunities. We have one person working with public health, and one person working with accessibility and fair trade, and one person working with chemicals, and one person with agriculture, and a few persons working with energy and climate, and then all of us working with everything as well. So that is a way of making sure that everything's being and being considered.
Växjö is doing great work. And both Cheryl and Henrik remarked on how they could do better, how they're falling short. Henrik pointed out that the goal of being 100% fossil-free by 2030 is unlikely. It might be more like 2035. At the same time, Sweden announced at the start of 2018 that they aim to be carbon neutral by 2045. To say that Växjö has a damn good support network being in Sweden would be an understatement. So many of the issues that we have in the US are just not seen here in Sweden.
Well, in Sweden, the cities have a lot of power. We can decide, we have our own power plant, and we can decide what we fuel that power plant with. So whereas in other countries in Europe, some of those, it's the national government that decides what powers a city. So the city doesn't have much to say. So in a way, we're kind of spoiled in Sweden that we do have the power to decide for ourselves what kind of energy we use. You were asking about the fossil fuel industry, if they had strong lobbying here in Sweden. And the thing is, we don't have our own oil production or not that much gas production either. So they're not very strong here, whereas in the States, they are. I think I come from Oklahoma, where oil industry was really big. At the same time, Oklahoma has lots of sun and lots of wind. Why? I asked myself, why can't that energy sector become stronger? And I think the politicians just need to learn to listen to the right people. And it's going to be a hard transition for the politicians to make, I think.
And that's putting it mildly. And yes, it's obviously a shit ton easier to implement environmentally progressive projects and legislation when you don't have Exxon breathing down your neck, when you don't have energy transfer partners threatening your family, assaulting you and your neighbors. My reporting on Växjö and Sweden as a whole is not to say, oh, look at how easy it'd be for the US, because I know better. What would make that road potentially easy is blocked and barricaded by thick corporate sludge, political collusion, legal bribery, and as George Carlin put it simply, the US is really just an oil company with an army. The tactics and plans we draw up will not look like those used in Sweden. They can't. But just as Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale pored over history to see how successful revolutions came to pass, we can and should pull from successful endeavors to see how we can pull from those experiences. In his book Revolutionary Suicide, Newton wrote that Black Panther's 10-point platform was specific to their place and time because it had to be. No revolutionaries before them had confronted that specific situation. And yet that platform was infused with what he and Seale had learned from history. Because our battles are the same in so many ways. We are all and will all be fighting to survive in a climate that can no longer sustain our greed and our ways of life. The more we share, the more we educate ourselves, the more we demand better for and from our communities, the more we will progress towards that resolute goal of a world where people and planet really are worth more than profit. In solidarity on that path, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the roots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some rocks to throw. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left one of you motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch. We got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and said my shove. I'm not